Since October marks the 2-year anniversary of my original characters, the Tasty 8, today we're going to be giving them some Halloween costumes. And what better theme for their costumes than Delicious in Dungeon? Just look at them. We'll also be making some miniature candy bars to finish off our Halloween photo shoot. These are the Tasty 8, my original superhero cookie dudes. I created them 2 years ago for a recurring toy story I tell on my Instagram account. This orange cookie here is the cosplay template that I started with. I then made these silicone molds with that orange template so that I could quickly make more cookie dudes whenever I had a story idea for them. And of course, they've got their own clay blend. This is mostly Sculpey clay with a little bit of white cos clay added in to make my cookie dudes slightly flexible. So I get started by adding some of my Tasty 8 dough to my cookie people molds, and I use some finish sandpaper to press some cookie texture onto them before popping them in the freezer for a few minutes. Freezing them for a bit allows me to easily remove them from the molds without them getting smushed. Using my metal sculpting tools, I gently push them into their final poses and texture their other sides with my sandpaper. After baking my cookie dudes, I use my little sandpaper on them again, but this time for actual sanding, to remove some of that excess edge clay that you sometimes get when making things from molds. I could remove this excess clay before baking, but it's a lot easier to handle the clay and not mess them all up in the process when it's already baked. This is also where the little bit of cos clay in my Tasty 8 dough comes in handy, to keep these guys a little bit more flexible, because it's really easy for me to break them if they're only made with Sculpey clay. And here's all 12 of my Tasty 8 babies after baking and sanding. Now they're ready to be decorated, but first they need to look baked. So for that, I bring out my cream and tan chalk pastels. I mix some of the cream pastel with water, and then proceed to slather my cookie dudes with my chalk water mixture. And lastly, I place them down on their cardboard cookie sheet to let them dry. Once they're finally dry, I add some tan chalk to my water mixture, and then I bathe them all again, and let them relax one more time on their cookie sheet. Next, I bring out my cookie decorating ingredients, starting with everyone's favorite cookie icing, jet black clay. And these other color clays that were once liquid but have dried out since I last used them. And my personal favorite, forbidden chocolate. Doesn't that look freaking delicious? Yeah, that's why it's forbidden. From here, the first thing you want to do is rehydrate your colored clays by adding some mineral oil on top of them and carefully examining that nothing happened at all. Then you add fresh clay on top of your unrehydratable clay and pretend everything went as planned. And that's what I do here. I add some fresh green clay to my dried clay and mineral oil mixture. The first Tasty 8 dude I'll be dressing up for Halloween is Quinn. He will be cosplaying as Chilchuck. This is a good fit personality-wise because Quinn also complains a lot and looks like a baby compared to the rest of the crew. I start with some forbidden chocolate for Quinn's beautiful brown wig. And I'm applying this with a small needle, which is essentially a really tiny ballpoint tool. For his annoyed little eyes, I add on some teensy lines of black liquid clay. After baking him for about 2 minutes, to make sure I don't smear anything while applying his next details, I mix up the tan liquid clay for his shirt. And then I paint it on with a small ballpoint tool this time, since it's a larger area. I use some more forbidden chocolate for his cute little gloves and boots. Since these guys are super tiny and hard to see with my typical camera setup, I decided to try moving my camera closer to my table for a better view. I use some liquid red clay to paint on his judgy little mouth, and then I add on his tiny green scarf. For his signature Chilchuck ears, I start with a cylinder of baked peanut butter colored clay. I cut a little coin off of it, and then cut that coin in half. And boom, eensy weensy pretend edible ears. I add some clay glue to his annoyed little head and attach the ears on. Then he gets a little forbidden chocolate belt and a light gray belt buckle. Since I don't want to accidentally add too much liquid clay onto him because it's difficult, if not impossible, to wipe off, I do some touch-ups on his hair and shoes with some dark brown acrylic paint. With Chilchuck done, I get started on the wooden wand that will accompany my Marcel cosplayer. Hungry as I am, I once again use my forbidden chocolate for this and a piece of non-stick foil, because I don't think I could easily remove this wand from my wooden baking slab if I smeared it directly onto the slab and baked it. This is Sandy. Well, this is Sandy. That's Sandy too, but you just can't tell yet. She's gonna be my Marcel cosplayer. Sandy's character is based off of me, and her role is making and crafting things to support her team. Somewhat similarly, Marcel's role is using her magic abilities to support her team. I get started by giving her a nice bluish-greenish dress. And while that dress bakes in the oven, I mix up some solid and liquid yellow clays until I get a nice frosting consistency for Marcel's blonde hair. Delicious. Before applying Sandy's blonde hair frosting, and after baking her dress and wand, I dexterously remove her wand from the foil with my pinky nail. Also, before applying the hair frosting, I put a piece of foil under Sandy, again because it might stick to the wood if I don't. The hair is harder to apply than the other more liquidy clays I've used so far, so I bake this first layer of hair for about 2 minutes, and then apply a bit more hair on top of that. And for her eyes, well, for her other eye is a monocle, I use some black liquid clay like I did with Quinn's eyes, and I give her a nice happy expression. For her monocle, I apply a tiny dot of clay glue on her face, and I bring out my Tasty 8 parts bag, which is just a bag of tiny baked clay pieces that I cut to size for my Tasty 8's typical accessories. I add a tiny black coin for the base of her monocle, and a teensier red coin on top of that. Lastly, I add some clay glue onto her hand and foot, and attach her staff to it. After another quick baking, I add the red hair ties onto her hair, and I give her a little red smiley mouth, a forbidden chocolate belt, and her light bluish green shawl. For her ears, I cut a coin off of my peanut butter cylinder, trim it into 2 elf-shaped ears, and then glue them onto her head. Next up is my boy Senshi, who will be played by my boy Guy. Guy was the perfect choice for Senshi, since both of them are the chef of their respective groups. I start Guy off with the first layer of his dwarf helmet. After a quick baking, I continue adding more of his helmet details, and I add some forbidden chocolate for the base layer of his shirt. For the helmet horns, I bring out a sheet of cream-colored cosclay that I previously baked after applying this waffle texture to it, using the knurling from my X-Acto knife. I trim 2 teensy horns out of it and attach them onto the helmet with some clay glue. And since I'm pretty sure they'll sag in the oven if I don't reinforce them, I add little pieces of foil behind him, while I continue struggling to get the horns in the right position. This went on for over 3 minutes, but I've trimmed it down to less than 30 seconds for the sake of everyone's sanity. After successfully baking the horns in place, I paint on his greaves and bracers. Next up is Senshi's iconic luscious beard. I start off with just some black liquid clay for this, but I realized it was too smooth, so I added some solid clay to it to give it a more wispy frosting consistency. Then I give him Senshi's adorable little mustache and Guy's signature eyes. Using some gray paint this time, I add some more details onto Guy's accessories, as well as on his shirt so that you can actually see where his beard ends. And then I enter too much territory by adding some white paint details on his shirt and arms, and then immediately trying to scrape them off because I don't like it. Since that doesn't work, I paint over it with some gray paint. After adding the little white X on his helmet, I continue the detailing by painting some lines on his horns. Next up is AP, the leader of the Tasty 8. Naturally, he'll be playing the role of the Delicious in Dungeon leader, Laios, since AP is really great at keeping the Tasty 8 motivated, happy, and productive. After getting some yellow frosting here, he gets a layer of gray frosting for his shirt, as well as for his leg and arm accessories. For his shoulder pads, I glue 2 little rectangles of my clay waffle sheet onto him, and then layer some gray liquid clay on top of that. He gets some adorable little forbidden chocolate shoes and belt, and then I add some little gray dots onto the bottom of his armor to give it some vague chainmail texture. Lastly, he gets a subtle little smile before baking for a few minutes. And before moving on to our next costume, I thicken AP's belt and add a little gray buckle on top. Next up is Cam, who will be cosplaying as Utsumi. In Delicious in Dungeon, Izutsumi's character has been transformed into a cat person by a magic spell, and Cam's superpower is morphing herself into different characters or things. So this is a perfect costume for her. For Cam's cat ears, I start off with some dark brown, just kidding, I start off with some of my waffle sheet, and trim off 2 little triangles for her ears. Then Cam gets some fabulous forbidden chocolate hair, which also serves as the glue to attach her little cat ears. Next up are her black body spots. After a quick baking, I apply some forbidden chocolate for her top and bottom. Then I use some red liquid clay for her red arm accessories and her neck scarf, and I paint over her ears to match her hair color. Since Cam's iconic facial feature is her huge black eyebrows, I make some of those by trimming this coin of black baked clay to the right shape and size, and then magically make them disappear onto her face. I paint on her eyes and whiskers, and one of the whiskers is too thick, so I thin it out by scraping it away with my X-Acto knife. After another 2-minute baking, Cam gets a cute little cat mouth. I also thicken the layer of her top and bottom with some red liquid clay because it was looking too low relative to her black cat spots. For her last little detail, Cam gets a long black cat tail, which I then trim a bit because I thought it looked a little too thick. Next up is Chewy, the most flexible cookie dude of the Tasty 8. Last year, Chewy's Halloween costume was this flat waffle crepe thing, so I figured this year he should also have a ridiculous costume, which is one of Marcel's unmistakably derpy familiars. I glue on Chewy's little waffle beak, give it a quick baking, and then frost him with some red liquid clay. After another quick baking, is anyone keeping count? Chewy is looking like a tasty little hot tamale candy. I try to make his circle eye with some liquid clay, but it immediately fills up into a dot, so I wipe it off and instead use some black acrylic paint for his eyes. After completing the fastest and tastiest looking cookie, I move on to Mac's costume. Since we ran out of humanoid crew members, Mac is going to be a friendly little golem. It's kind of a stretch, but I guess you can say that Mac's job as a medic is similar to the golem's job of growing vegetables that keep the crew healthy. After giving his mud brown frosting a quick baking, I layer on some green liquid clay for his mossy spots. After another 2-minute baking, I glue on Mac's iconic white eyebrows, as well as his sweet little white frosting eyes. To add a little more detail to his golem costume, I apply some tiny green dots onto his mossy areas. The finishing touch for Mac is a little forbidden chocolate mouth. Let's get a closer look. So cute. Last but not least of our Tasty 8 crew is Shy Guy Yuni, who my daughter very aptly named because of his prominent unibrow. Again, since we've run out of human characters, Yuni is going to have to be the awkward but adorable walking mushroom. I start by layering on some pieces of trimmed waffle sheet onto his head. Then I just continue layering and layering and layering, both liquid and solid clays, to turn what started off as a waffle pillow into a waffle sandwich hat. After a quick baking, I layer some of my prettiest liquid red clay on top of the hat and clean off some of the spillage with an X-Acto knife. After my 956th micro baking of this project, I give Yuni a nice smooth layer of mushroom colored frosting, as well as some little red feetsies and some mushroom cap spots. I apply his signature unibrow and... Camera, please. There he is. Now we can both see, and it's love at first sight. After adding his cute little eyes, he gets a cute little surprised mouth. With all of my cookie dudes costumes completed, it's time for their finishing touches, starting with some honey brown paint on their backs to mimic the look of baked cookie bottoms. After letting their cookie bottoms dry, I finally cover all of my hard work in a thick layer of white clay, defeating the entire purpose of everything I've done so far. Or maybe it's just Mod Podge to keep their frosted parts frosty and give them a slightly glossy finish. And for the parts I want to be super shiny, I apply some Sculpey gloss on top. Before our long-awaited snack time, I want to show you real quick some of the liquid clays I used and mixed for the various frostings today. The Cos Clay ones are more oily and glossy than the Sculpey ones, which allows for some nice visual varieties. For our snack today, my daughter and I will finally be enjoying some forbidden chocolate icing. No, I mean Halloween Oreos, which are freaking adorable and freaking delicious. About 5 years ago, I printed out some 1/12 scale candy bar labels, and every Halloween since then, I've assembled some of them into actual teensy candy bars. And every year, I forget how I assembled them. So I end up reverse engineering one of the previous year's candy bars to figure out what the heck I did. This is more or less what the sheet of candy bars looked like before I trimmed each label individually. I also found that this photo paper was a little too glossy for these cereal boxes. But anyways, let's get started on this Snickers bar. The first step is peeling away as much of the back of the photo paper as I reasonably can, because the original paper is way too thick to fold into a decent looking candy bar that will actually maintain its shape over time. I use my tweezers to cleanly fold my Snickers label to its final candy bar shape. Then I take some of my recycled Dino Nugget cardboard and cut it to the size of a tiny candy bar. I do that twice to get the thickness I want for my final Snickers bar. Then I trim some 3M double-sided tape to the size of my Snickers label, and I definitely don't struggle to peel it for 5 minutes straight. I attach it onto my Snickers label and totally don't struggle to peel it a second time. I stack my 2 candy bar shaped cardboard pieces inside of the label and fold it into its candy bar shape. I finish it off by pressing my nails into the sides of it to give it those little creases that candy bars often have. Since that first Snickers bar came out kinda thick, I made a second one off camera with a more accurate shape. For my M&M bag, I use a similar process, except that this candy bag only needs one fold down the middle. I apply my double-sided tape to it and then use this tiny wad of paper towel to create the illusion of candy inside of the bag. Again, I use my nails to add some creases along the edges of the bag, and I trim off some of the excess tape to finish it off. For my Crunch bar, I want to give it that old school look with the exposed foil. Do they even sell them like that anymore? Anyways, I cover a rectangular piece of Dino Nugget cardboard with some foil. Then I add some double-sided tape to one side of it and wrap the Crunch bar label around the whole thing. With my nostalgic Crunch bar finished, it's time for our photo shoot. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.